Chapter 10. The Confesio, Patrick's testimony of God's mercy. Among all the writings of the early Christian world, few are as personal and moving as the Confesio of St. Patrick. It is not a biography written by someone else. It is not a collection of legends created centuries later. It is Patrick himself speaking, an elderly bishop looking back across the long road of his life, a former slave remembering the mountains where he learned to pray, a missionary reflecting on the mysterious ways of God. The Confesio is not primarily the story of Patrick's achievements. It is the story of God's mercy. Why did Patrick write the Confesio? The exact date of the Confesio is unknown, but most historians believe Patrick wrote it near the end of his life, perhaps during the 440s or 450s. By this time, Patrick was no longer the frightened teenager who had been carried away into slavery. He was a bishop, a respected missionary. He was a bishop and missionary whose Christian communities were beginning to take root in Ireland. Yet he did not write to celebrate his success. Instead, he wrote because his mission had been questioned. Some critics had challenged his authority. They questioned whether someone like Patrick, a man who admitted his own weaknesses and lacked the highest level of education, should have such an important role in the church. Patrick responded not by defending his reputation through pride. He defended God's grace. His message was simple: if God could use me, then everything good that happened came from Him. I am Patrick, a sinner. The opening words of the Confesio immediately reveal Patrick's humility. He begins, I am Patrick, a sinner, the most unlearned, the least of all the faithful, and utterly despised by many. These words are astonishing. Imagine a bishop whose name would become famous throughout the world, a man whose feast day would be celebrated for centuries, a man remembered as the apostle of an entire nation. Yet he begins by calling himself a sinner, unlearned, the least. This was not false humility. Patrick genuinely believed that everything he possessed came from God. His greatness was not something he claimed. It was something God had done through him. The memory of his early life. Patrick then looks back upon his childhood. He does not hide his spiritual weakness. He admits that before his captivity, he did not truly know God. Although raised in a Christian family, his faith was not yet alive. He writes that he was like many young people, living without serious concern for eternity, trusting in his own understanding, failing to recognize God's presence. Then came suffering. The event that seemed like a disaster became the beginning of his conversion. Patrick does not say that slavery was good. He does not minimize the evil of what happened, but he recognizes that God brought good out of his suffering. This is a deeply Christian understanding of redemption. God does not always prevent suffering, but He can transform suffering into something holy. The God who found him in the wilderness. One of the most beautiful themes in the Confesio is that Patrick discovered God not in comfort, but in abandonment. When everything human was taken away, God remained. When family disappeared, God remained. When freedom disappeared, God remained. Patrick's captivity became the place where he encountered Christ personally. The lonely hills of Ireland became sacred ground. There, while tending sheep, Patrick discovered that although he had lost almost everything, he had not been forgotten by God. The young slave discovered that although he had lost everything, he was not forgotten. A call from God. Patrick's understanding of his mission was deeply connected to God's providence. He did not believe he chose Ireland simply because he wanted adventure. He believed God had prepared him. The dream calling him back to Ireland was not merely a personal desire, it was a vocation. Patrick often uses the language of being called. He saw himself as someone sent, like the apostles, like the prophets, like Paul. His mission was not about personal achievement. It was obedience. I am a debtor to God. One of the most powerful phrases in the Confesio is Patrick's statement, I am a debtor to God. What did he mean? Patrick believed he owed everything to God's mercy: his survival, his faith, his calling, his missionary work, his converts. Everything was grace. This explains why he was willing to endure hardship. He was not trying to earn God's love. He was responding to a love he had already received. Patrick's view of suffering. Patrick's life was filled with suffering, kidnapping, slavery, danger, opposition, criticism. Yet his writings are not filled with bitterness. Why? Because Patrick interpreted suffering through the cross of Christ. Jesus himself suffered before entering glory. Therefore, suffering could become a place of union with Christ. Patrick never glorified suffering for its own sake, but he believed no suffering offered to God was wasted. Every hardship could become an instrument of grace. The humility of a missionary. Perhaps one of the most beautiful aspects of Patrick's spirituality is that he never views the Irish people as a project. They are not statistics. They are not achievements. They are souls loved by God. He writes about them with deep affection. The people who once enslaved him became the people he loved most. This transformation reveals the power of Christian forgiveness. Human nature says, remember the harm they caused you. Christ says, love them. Patrick chose Christ. Patrick's love for the Irish. Near the end of the Confesio, Patrick expresses his deep desire to remain with the Irish people. He writes that he would gladly spend his life among them, even though he had suffered greatly. Why? Because he believed God had given him a special responsibility. He was their spiritual father. He had baptized them. He had taught them. He had prayed for them. Their salvation mattered more than his comfort. This is the heart of a true shepherd. A life without regret. When Patrick looked back on his life, he did not see a story of personal success. He saw a story of divine mercy. The frightened teenager became a courageous bishop. The captive became a liberator. The outsider became the spiritual father of a nation. But Patrick never forgot the beginning. He remained the shepherd boy praying in the wilderness, the man who knew he was nothing without God. the spiritual message of the Confesio. The message of Patrick's writing remains powerful today. God can call ordinary people. God can transform suffering. God can use weakness. God can turn our past into part of His plan. Patrick's life demonstrates that holiness is not the absence of hardship. It is allowing God to work through hardship. The chains that once bound Patrick became the path that led him to freedom. The land that held him captive became the land he loved. The people who took him away became the people he served. Only the grace of Christ could create such a transformation. The final years of the Apostle of Ireland. As Patrick entered old age, his mission had become firmly established. Christian communities continued to grow. Church leaders carried on his work. The gospel had taken root. But Patrick knew his earthly journey was coming to an end. Like every servant of God before him, he would eventually have to surrender everything back into God's hands. The shepherd who had spent decades caring for Christ's flock would soon hear the voice of the Good Shepherd calling him home. The exact details of Patrick's final years remain uncertain. History gives us only fragments. Tradition gives us beautiful memories. But one thing is certain: a young slave who once thought he was forgotten by God became one of Christianity's greatest missionaries. Chapter 11. The final days of St. Patrick, from earthly labor to eternal rest. After decades of missionary labor, the life of Patrick was drawing toward its conclusion. The young man who had once been carried away from Britain in chains had become the shepherd of an entire people. The frightened teenager who had cried out to God alone among the Irish hills had become a bishop whose influence would shape the history of Christianity. Yet Patrick's final years were not filled with earthly glory. He did not retire to a palace. He did not surround himself with wealth. He remained the same humble servant who had begun his mission with nothing but faith. The greatness of Patrick's life was not found in comfort. It was found in faithfulness. An aging missionary? By the later decades of his life, Patrick would have been an elderly man by the standards of the 5th century. If the traditional date of his birth around AD 385 is approximately correct, he may have lived into his 70s. Such an age was uncommon in the ancient world. His body had endured much: the hardships of slavery, long missionary journeys, exposure to harsh weather, constant travel, the emotional burden of shepherding a growing church. Yet Patrick continued serving. The missionary who had once walked across Ireland as a young man now carried the wisdom of many decades of experience. The fruit of his labor. When Patrick first arrived in Ireland, Christianity existed only among small communities. By the end of his ministry, the situation had changed dramatically. Churches had been established, priests had been ordained, bishops served Christian communities, thousands had entered the church. The faith that had once seemed foreign to many Irish people had become rooted within the island. But Patrick's greatest legacy was not simply numbers. It was the creation of a Christian culture, a culture that would later produce remarkable saints, scholars, missionaries, and monastic communities. the Ireland that emerged after Patrick would become known throughout Europe as a land of learning and holiness. Where did Patrick die? The exact circumstances of Patrick's death are uncertain. As with many figures from the early church, later traditions preserved memories of his final days, but historians must separate tradition from confirmed evidence. The strongest early traditions associate Patrick's final years with Saul in what is now County Down, Northern Ireland. According to tradition, Saul was one of the first places where Patrick established a church after arriving in Ireland. The area held a special place in Irish Christian memory. There, the great missionary who had spent his life traveling finally rested. The date of his death. Tradition places Patrick's death on March 17th, around AD 461. However, the exact year remains debated. Some scholars have proposed earlier or later dates. The historical evidence does not allow complete certainty. Nevertheless, March 17th became permanently associated with Patrick throughout Christian history. It became the day on which the Church remembers his life, his faith, and his missionary witness. The tradition of his final prayer. Later, Irish tradition tells a beautiful story about Patrick's final moments. It says that as he approached death, he received the Eucharist, prayed, and peacefully surrendered his soul to God. While we cannot verify every detail of this account historically, it reflects something completely consistent with Patrick's own writings. His entire life was directed toward Christ. From his first prayers as a slave to his final moments as a bishop, Patrick desired to belong completely to God. Where is St. Patrick buried? One of the enduring questions surrounding Patrick concerns his burial place. Tradition holds that he was buried near the church at Downpatrick, County Down. For centuries, pilgrims have visited the site associated with his tomb. Alongside him, tradition also associates this location with two other important Irish saints, Bridget of Kildare and Columba of Iona. Together, they became known in Irish tradition as the three great saints of Ireland. Historically, the exact burial locations of these saints cannot be proven with certainty, but the tradition itself reveals something important. The Irish people saw Patrick as part of a great spiritual family whose lives were dedicated to bringing Christ to their land. The growth of Irish Christianity. After Patrick's death, Christianity continued to expand. The church he helped establish matured. Monastic communities began to flourish. These monasteries became centers of prayer, education, manuscript copying, and missionary activity. In the centuries that followed, Irish monks traveled throughout Europe. They carried the gospel to places affected by political instability and the decline of Roman influence. They preserved important Christian writings. They educated generations of believers. The spiritual movement that Patrick helped begin became one of the great lights of medieval Christianity. The saint who changed a nation. Patrick's influence is extraordinary because of the transformation he witnessed. He entered Ireland as a slave. He left it as a missionary. He arrived powerless. He departed spiritually victorious. He had no army, no political authority, no wealth. Yet he changed the course of a nation. How? Not through force, not through domination, but through love. Patrick understood something profound. People's hearts are not conquered by power. They are changed by grace. The meaning of Patrick's life. The story of St. Patrick is ultimately not only about Ireland. It is about God's ability to transform human lives. Patrick's story begins with loss. A teenager kidnapped from his home, a slave separated from his family, a young man forgotten by the world. But God was not absent. The years Patrick considered wasted became the years that prepared him. His suffering became compassion. His captivity became a calling. His weakness became strength. His enemy became his mission field. The legacy of forgiveness. Perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of Patrick's life is forgiveness. Many people can serve those who love them. Few can serve those who once harmed them. Patrick returned to Ireland not because he forgot what happened. He returned because Christ had healed his heart. The gospel had done something impossible. It transformed a place of suffering into a place of love. The island that had taken his freedom became the island where he found his purpose. The lasting memory of St. Patrick. Today, more than 15 centuries after his death, Patrick's name is known throughout the world. Churches bear his name. Communities celebrate his feast. Missionaries remember his courage. Christians look to him as an example of trusting God's providence. Yet perhaps the greatest lesson of Patrick's life is found in his own humility. God does not require perfect circumstances. God does not require extraordinary beginnings. God can take a frightened young man, a former slave, and an unlikely servant, and use him to bring light to an entire nation. St. Patrick's story is not merely the story of Ireland's patron saint. It is the story of redemption, a story of a God who finds people in the wilderness, a story of a shepherd who became a missionary, a story of a captive who became a liberator, a story of a man who discovered that nothing offered to God is ever wasted. The boy who once stood alone among the Irish hills could never have imagined what God had planned. He only knew one thing: Christ had called him, and he answered.